Good evening. My name is Tom Vanderbilt. I am the chair of Saffron Walden Constituency Labour Party, we've organised tonight as a public meeting with a speaker, and I will hand over to Sam Knight to introduce Prem, our speaker, and Sam is our membership secretary and BAME officer. Sam.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. So we have a guest speaker tonight. Prem Sikka is a member of the UK House of Lords. He has held professorships at the Universities of East London, Essex and Sheffield, and is Emeritus Professor of Accounting at the University of Essex. His research on accountancy, auditing, tax avoidance, tax havens, corruption, corporate governance, money laundering, insolvency and business affairs has been published in international scholarly journals, books, newspapers and magazines. He has appeared on domestic and international radio and TV programmes to comment on business matters. He has advised and given evidence to a number of UK and EU parliamentary committees. He advised the UK House of Commons Work and Pensions Committee for its investigation into the collapse of BHS and Carillion. Prem holds the Working for Justice Award from Tax Justice Network, Accounting Exemplar Award from the American Accounting Association, Lifetime Achievement Awards from the British Accounting and Finance Association, and PQ Magazine, Personality of the Year Award from Accountancy Age, and the inaugural 2017 Abraham Brilloff Award from the Accountant and International Accounting Bulletin for promoting transparency and public accountability of businesses. In January 2019, he was named by Accountancy Age as one of the 50 most influential individuals in the world of accounting. So a warm welcome to Prem. Thank you so much for joining us. And over to you. We'll hear from you, and then we're over to the floor for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Samantha, and hello and good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to join this meeting, especially as we are facing a very different kind of a world now. The economy is opening up, but the last thing we really want to do is go back to a pre-COVID world, because that was not exactly nice for many people. And the COVID tragedy highlighted that more people on low incomes, poor incomes died compared to richer citizens. Poor housing, poor food, poor wages took their toll. And we really don't want to go back to that kind of a world. We need to be able to build a better world. Now, where exactly do we start, and how do we start? Well, one response is start wherever you like, because wherever you look, there are issues which need to be tackled. And obviously, it's not overnight we will be able to transform society. It will take joint effort, joint labor for quite some time. And some people may think that the tasks are too big, which I'm going to refer to. But I think a moment's reflection will tell us that against all the odds, our ancestors struggled and secured so many rights, whether it was a right to universal healthcare, education, right to vote, right to have trade unions, banning discrimination based on gender, race, ethnicity, and many other things. If against all the odds they could do it, surely we can bring about emancipatory change as well. So where do we start? So let me sort of just go over the recent kind of events, fairly recent ones. For the last 50 years in United Kingdom, we have been in the grip of neoliberalism, whose main tenets are more than just the preoccupation with mythical search or promotion of free markets. Contrary to popular belief, neoliberals have not reduced the size of the state, but what they have done is actually restructured the state. So the state has been completely restructured so that it does the bidding of the few, though occasionally some crumbs are thrown to the masses to keep them quiet and to passive. The state actually has become a guarantor of corporate profits. This is evidenced by privatization of the vast swathes of previously publicly owned enterprises, and after the privatization was done at knockdown prices. Many of these privatized industries continue to receive huge public subsidies. Last year alone, railway companies received a subsidy of £8.5 billion. And we still the highest fare per train mile in Europe. Gas and electricity prices have gone through the roof. Water companies have become experts at tax avoidance, and I've written about that. Yet regulators do nothing or very, very little about it. Regulators are frequently in the pockets of the industry because the leading lights in the world of regulation come from the industry, and after a stint as a regulator, they go back to the industry. Their inclination is to be more sympathetic to the issues facing the industry rather than protecting or dealing with the welfare of the consumers and public. And you can see that wherever you look. About 2 years ago, I did a project for the Labour front bench on how to possibly revamp regulation. We wrote a report. I went around and I met many regulators, and one question I asked all of them: what exactly is your purpose? And the universal mantra was that we are here to serve the public. Well, my next question was, where is exactly the public on your governance structures? Are they on your boards? Are they in majority? How do you know that you're serving the public interest? At that point, there was almost complete silence. They had no answer to that kind of question. And indeed, if you look at the regulatory bodies, the public is generally excluded from it. So we have a state which is really goes easy on corporate scandals, particularly financial scandals. So we have had a banking crisis in every decade since the 1970s. Numerous financial products have been missold. In pursuit of easy profits and reckless risk-taking, bankers crashed the financial system and the economy. And a never-ending austerity ushered in on the back of that. It is not bankers who were punished. It was people who never really caused any of this who got punished. The bankers openly admit to rigging interest and exchange rates, but they face effectively no or very little retribution. The government bailed out banks after the 2007 and 8 crash by providing £1,162 billion worth of support, mainly in guarantees and some cash. So how exactly has this obsession with the finance industry actually served us at all? Academic research shows that the finance industry made a negative contribution. Again, I emphasize a negative contribution of £4.5 trillion to the UK economy for the period of 1997 to 2015. No other industry has ever been such a burden on any economy, yet that is the industry which continues to be promoted.
Well, how do you do that, Richard?
The government...
There is a volume thing there. I don't know what it's set on.
I could hear somebody else here. Oh, okay. The government, which could not find the money to feed hungry school children and is unwilling to make the £20 increase in universal credit permanent, has now suddenly found £875 billion worth of quantitative easing to buy up corporate bonds and prop up capital markets. Of course, that has really created a kind of a bubble in the asset market, and we're seeing that in the housing market as well. So speculators have been the main winners from this state intervention. The government has destroyed people's savings by instituting ultra-low interest rates. Banks are getting their raw material practically free, i.e. very little they pay us on the savings, but even the overdraft rates are about 40%. There's no other industry which gets its raw material actually free. The indulgence of finance industry is giving us more scandals. Despite the banking crash, large parts of the finance industry are still not regulated. They are called shadow banks, which includes private equity and hedge funds. Now, the size of of shadow banks is $200 trillion. Just think about it, $200 trillion worth of finance industry, which is still not regulated. And that is nearly half of all the world's financial assets. So the bankruptcy of Greensill and London Capital and Finance just shows us how dangerous it is not to regulate the world of finance. Yet the governments have not indicated any change in policies. We have a lopsided economy where manufacturing, which creates numerous skilled and semi-skilled jobs, has actually been shrinking. So the multiplier effect in the world of manufacturing is much greater than in the world of finance. So if you create one skilled manufacturing job, or you manufacture products, well, be they computers, artificial intelligence, or anything else, an additional job is at least created. But that is not frequently the case in the world of the finance industry. So the finance industry, which brings us crisis after crisis, continues to be favored by successive UK governments. The UK now has some 375,000 professionally qualified accountants as a result. This is the highest number of accountants per capita in the world. No other country has this number per capita in the world. Yet this huge social investment has not given us good corporate governance, has not made our pensions any safer, has not given us any freedom from scandals, frauds, bad audits, or bad accounting practices. So there is a constant stream of scandals and frauds and fiddles. The finance industry is actually devouring social fabric. So I was asked by the Work and Pensions Committee to investigate and report on the collapse of Bernard Matthews. So Bernard Matthews, a well-known poultry business, which many of you would remember, he had beautiful turkeys. That business was bought by private equity. Private equity basically then went on to asset strip the business. Usually they load the business with debt, very little share capital. They were charging 20% interest, effectively giving themselves, they were the shareholders and they were putting money in via loans, charging 20% interest. At the end, they decided just to sell the assets, not the whole business, just the tangible assets. So the new owner had offered to buy the whole thing, including pension liabilities, obligations to creditors, obviously for a lower amount, but the private equity people said, no, we will just sell the assets. And they then dumped all the liabilities due to the pension scheme, the creditors, HMRC, local councils, suppliers, and everybody else. And that is happening at numerous places. And the most recent business with that in the news has been Debenhams. So the state has also been used to normalize assault on the working class. Trade unions have been weakened, and I will give you some evidence in a moment. The income of bosses has risen, and the workers are left with never-ending austerity and wage freezes. We also have regressive taxation in this country, one of the few in the Western world. Again, I will give you some examples in a moment. So tax avoidance by big corporations and the rich is right. Governments had found it easier to transfer taxes away from capital to labor, consumer, and savings. So corporations may not vote, but their interests are writ large in all legislative processes. They are right in it right from the beginning. They are always consulted. I can see that in Parliament on a daily basis. Big business sends advisors to government departments, frames the terms of legislation, and disciplines governments with threats of economic chaos by saying, well, if you don't give us X, we will go to another country. Corporate elites sit on bodies adjudicating mergers and takeovers. They sit on the board of HMRC. They sit on committees which write new tax laws. So they decide whether something counts as tax abuse or not. Ministers protect corporations from prosecutions for criminal conduct. And I recently provided evidence of that, real live evidence, to the House of Lords, and I will come back to that later on. You only have to look at the register of the MPs and the Lords' interest and see how many of them are consultants to corporations. MPs get paid £82,000 a year. Isn't that a full-time job? Where do they find time to do so many other consultancies? And they're only getting those consultancies because they are MPs. There is no other reason for that. So effectively, the legislative system has been sold to the highest bidder. It is often said that the UK has the best democracy that money can buy. From what I have seen, money has already bought it. And that is usually evident in daily debates in Parliament. So let's look at some of the evidence relating to what I said. In the UK, 6 richest people control as much wealth as the poorest 13 million, or 100 people have as much wealth as 18 million of the poorest people. Now, of course, if you don't have enough money, that has an impact on the kind of food you eat, the housing you have, healthcare you have, education, pension, retirement security, and many other things. So you can see how the dice is loaded. Poor people can't afford to buy newspapers and magazines or TV and radio stations to influence policymakers. James Dyson was able to send a text message to Boris Johnson and get a tax concession. Most of us can't just afford to do that. And why would Boris Johnson want to respond to whatever we say anyway? So you can see what's happening. The richest 10% of the households in the UK hold 44% of all wealth. The poorest 50% only have 8% of the wealth. The poorest fifth of society has only 8% of the total income generated in any given year. The top fifth takes 40%. In just 3 days, the chief executives of FTSE 100 companies will collect more in remuneration than what an average worker would collect in a whole year. So imagine if you, I, and others were able to vote on executive pay. So imagine if consumers and employees could vote on executive pay. Would they really get away with it? Or would they have to say, hang on, we better give consumers value for money, better service, better make sure that income is equitably spread. Otherwise, simply we will not vote for them. So you can see straight away, there is a case for democratizing corporations. Companies do know who the customers are. Bank knows who you are. Insurance companies know who you are. Water companies, gas, electricity. Even supermarkets know who you are because many of us hold loyalty cards. But no change is coming there at all. So governments have been willing to hit the average person. So in February 2020, the average weekly wage in the UK was £474 compared to £473 in March 2008. That is an increase of £1 in 12 years. Just think about what's happened to the cost of living. And even this number is grossly, probably exaggerated, higher than it actually is, because this includes the wages, remuneration collected by bankers, fat cat executives, and Premier League footballers. If we were able to strip that out, the average person is probably worse off than they were a decade ago. So even before COVID in the UK, 14.5 million people, including 8.1 million people who are at work or living below the poverty line. 4.5 million children lived in poverty. This is all before COVID. It's all going to get worse. Okay, and so we are one of the richest, at least the 6th richest country on this planet. How did we come to this? So there's been no invisible hand. There is no invisible hand of fate. All this is the outcome of the political institutions that we have created, that we go along with. It is all changeable. It can be changed. It must be changed. So there has been a systematic attack on trade unions and workers' rights. The minimum wage is too low. 0-hour contracts have condemned many people to permanent poverty, and there is job insecurity. So in 1976, I mentioned 1976, that was just around the era when neoliberalism was first emerging. That was a time when collective bargaining was strong and trade unions were strong. So in 1976, the workers' share of gross domestic product in the form of wages and salaries was 65.1%. Now I mean just before COVID, because current statistics are not that reliable. Just before COVID, that 65.1% had shrunk to 49.5%. That is the biggest decline in workers' share of the GDP in any industrialized country on this planet. And again, the situation for ordinary people is probably worse, because the numbers I quoted you include, again, fat cat executives, bankers, and Premier League footballers, and we can't easily strip them out of this data. So the idea that somebody could buy their home, well, that just remains a dream now, because salaries don't really equip anybody to buy their own home. So people on a low income can't even save for old age. If you're earning less, just how much can you put away in a pension scheme? You can't put away a lot. And inevitably, people will rely on the state pension as their main source of income. So the government, a lot of senior conservatives at the moment are talking about removing what they call the triple lock on state pension, but actually they are mistaken. So despite the triple lock, the average UK state pension is 29% of average earnings. It is the lowest amongst the economically developed countries, and it is less than half of the national minimum wage. Now, if national minimum wage is minimum, why does anybody expect senior citizens to live on half of that? That is absolutely scandalous. Every year, thousands of senior citizens die from cold. People have to make choices between food and heating, and they just can't afford both. Roughly 3 million Brits are treated each year for malnourishment. 1.3 million of these are over the age of 65. That is what has happened to our country, folks. It is unacceptable. The government is not seeking to allow the state pension with minimum wage. And I will be launching a campaign on that fairly soon. And I do been talking to a lot of MPs and others in the Lords and some trade unions. We will push for it. We may not get it this year, next year, year after, but it has to happen, because that is the bleak future awaiting many people who will retire 10, 15, 20 years, that they will simply need to survive on the state pension, which is terrible. So rather than embracing progressive taxation and redistribution to level up, which is a government slogan, the government has actually used regressive policies to hit the poorest. Now, remember, if your salary is frozen, your pension is low, and council tax goes up, well, that's going to take out a large chunk of your income. You're already paying VAT at 20%, whether you're a millionaire or a pauper. So what is the effect of these things? So let me just quote Taxpayers Alliance, because a lot of conservatives would accept their numbers. But the Taxpayer Alliance tells us that poorest 10% of the households in the UK, that's the poorest 10%, pay 47.6% of their income in direct and indirect taxes, compared to 33.5% by the richest 10%. So the poor pay higher taxes. When they say taxes are killing us, they are actually absolutely right. They are killing people. So VATs at the rate of 20% is incredibly regressive. Hits the poorest the most. That's just one example. Council tax is regressive. Whether a property is worth million or 350,000, you end up paying virtually the same council tax. And that has no regard to your ability to actually pay. Does not relate to your income at all. So the poorest tenth of the population pay 8% of their income in council tax, and the richest 40% only pay 2 to 3% of their income in council tax. What about the national insurance contributions? Well, that's another regressive tax. You pay 12% on average if you're an employee, up to £50,000 on income of up to 50,000 a year. Beyond that, it is 2%. So if you are making 150,000, half a million, the amount you're paying in national insurance contribution as a percentage of your income is considerably less. Capital gains tax. Capital gains are generally made by people who have second homes, investments, own artworks, security stocks and shares. So the government has created a totally new regime for. So capital gains are taxed on average at rates between 10% and 28%. There are lots of ifs and buts. On the other hand, earned income is taxed at rates from 20% to 45%. There's a huge tax avoidance industry at work trying to convert income to capital gains so that those who have unearned income can dodge vast amounts of tax. If the government was to treat unearned income, i.e. capital gains, in the same way, tax it in the same way as earned income, it would generate £14 billion a year. 14 billion. The government says paying £20 in universal credit, which they introduced, and at the moment they won't tell us whether they will keep on with it or withdraw it. They say that costs £7 billion. I'm just saying they can double it by just eliminating the special tax relief only available to the rich. What about pension contributions? Government gives about £40 billion a year in tax relief on pension contributions. Just 10% of the taxpayers, generally high rate taxpayers, take 50% of that. Rest get very. There are 1.3 million individuals who are in pension schemes at the moment, their employers' pension schemes or other pension schemes. They get zero tax relief because their total income is less than £12,500 a year, which is the tax-free allowance. They get zero help from the government. So you're the poorest, you made some effort to provide for your pension, and you get zero support. If government was to say, okay, folks, we will give everybody a tax relief or a credit equivalent to 20%, i.e. basic rate, which people would argue would be more equitable, that would still leave £10 billion spare for other things that the government might want to spend on, such as increasing the state pension or filling the potholes in your street. So just some suggestions. Now, the government tells us that every year it's been increasing personal allowances. Now, let's think about the personal allowances, which currently stand at £12,500 a year. Now, if government increases personal allowances by £100 a year, that only saves £20 in tax for the basic rate tax, £40 for the higher rate, and £45 for the richest. And there are 18.4 million individuals in the UK whose income is less than 12,500. 18.4 million. Increase in personal allowances is of zero benefit. They get absolutely nothing. So once again, the poorest get nothing out of it whatsoever. So now the rich can also afford private health care. That is how we have a lot of private hospitals. What about the rest of us? In 2010, the NHS waiting queue was reduced to 2.5 million to 2.5 million. But even before coronavirus, the NHS waiting list rose to 4.6 million. in September 2019. Now, the latest numbers at the end of March 2021 are 4.95 million, nearly 5 million, and about 450,000 people have been waiting for more than a year. So what did the government do in the last budget? They said they spent more, but if you take out the coronavirus factor, and if you look at the plan for the next year, they actually are planning to cut the health service. There are cuts, okay? And obviously they will be selling off parts of it as well. So we live in a country where now people can't even afford to buy water. 1.5 million people are considered to be in water poverty. 3 points, and on top of that, another 3 million are on the verge of it. In other words, they can't afford to pay the water bills. Water falls from heaven. It is free. All somebody has to do is collect it and pipe, but we have turned it into a profitable opportunity for water companies. Virtually every water company, and I have written about it over the years, is into tax avoidance. And if you want to ask me later on how they do it, I'll be happy to give you some examples. So UK has now become a home to dirty money. Lots of the world's dirty money flows through London, and of course generates vast amount of revenues from accountants, lawyers, bankers, estate agents, and other intermediaries. Shell companies are used, companies which never ever trade. Anyone from anywhere in the world can form a company in the UK. No checks on the authenticity of the directors and shareholders are made. You could be in Ukraine, you could be in Timbuktu, you could be in High Wycombe, anywhere you can form a company. And many of these companies are simply front for basically frauds. Big accounting firms are at the forefront of tax avoidance. They generate tax avoidance schemes. Their partners sit on HMRC's board as well. They advise government departments. They actually draft tax legislation. So on many occasions, HMRC has taken some companies to court for avoiding taxes, and it turns out that the tax avoidance scheme was designed by a big accounting firm, and the judges have said that those schemes are unlawful. So despite strong court judgments, not a single accounting firm in this country has ever been investigated, disciplined, fined, prosecuted for knowingly selling unlawful tax avoidance schemes. They are banking on that tax authorities would be under-resourced and nobody's really going to catch up with them. Nothing happens to them. And again, I have raised that issue in Parliament. Over the last decade, i.e. since 2010, HMRC has failed to collect nearly 350 billion pound of taxes, mainly due to avoidance, evasion, error, and that kind of thing. Now, HMRC have a model, and others, including myself, do not agree with this model. We think it is highly deficient. So other models estimate that the tax gap, which is the difference between the tax which they collect and what they should be collecting, is between 58 and 100 billion pounds. That means in the last decade, nearly £1 trillion worth of taxes have not been actually collected. Why? Government does not want to invest in HMRC. HMRC has less resources now in real terms than it did a decade ago. No good saying that governments invested in technology, that's the same everywhere. But looking at tax avoidance scams scheme is a very labor-intensive job. You have to be looking for needles in a haystack and trying to connect the bits and pieces together. So our regulatory system is not up to it either. Again, I'll come back to that maybe during questions. Our political system depends on donations from the rich and corporations. Rich and corporations don't give money away. They make investment. They expect a return, and they are getting their return from, as you can gather from the statistics I've seen before. We have a corrupt political system. So let me just give you an example, which I actually referred to in Parliament. If you want to read more, I can refer you to my speech in the House of Lords. So in 2012, HSBC was fined $1.9 billion in the US for facilitating money laundering. HSBC admitted in writing that it had been engaged in criminal conduct. Now, HSBC is supervised by the regulators in the UK. It is considered to be a UK. Shouldn't that have prompted the UK authorities to investigate, unless they show that it's American executives, drink different kind of water and they have a different genetic structure and they are more prone to doing these things? Nothing happened, amazingly. So in the US, another Senate committee, parliamentary committee, got very interested in this and hang on, this is the largest ever fine. The entities admitted criminal wrongdoing. Why on earth has there been no prosecution? So they launched their own investigation and then produced a report in 2016. What that report showed is that in this country, without any statement to Parliament, without any public mention, the then Chancellor George Osborne, the Governor of the Bank of England, and the regulator, then it was FSA, Financial Services Authority, jointly wrote to the US authorities asking them to go easy on HSBC because the bank was too big to fail. It had facilitated money laundering for drug traffickers, gangsters, you name it. It sort of did it all. Okay. Now, even in 2016, the government come back and make a statement to Parliament? Sorry about that, folks. We've been caught. None of that. So I then raised this issue. And when you look at the US parliamentary report, it wasn't only HSBC they were protecting, they also protected Standard Chartered Bank. They also protected Barclays. And the US parliamentary report was also critical of Deloitte because they said it helped to falsify the records for Standard Chartered Bank. So I raised this in Parliament. Was there an apology from government? No. Was there any explanation? No. Was there any promise to say we would do it? No. Indeed, the response from some peers who are closely connected with big corporations was sometimes these things are necessary to protect jobs and so on. So what does that tell us about the state of democracy and telling the people and protecting consumers? Is it any surprise our banks are permanently mired in scandals? So I think I've gone over my half an hour, but I'll just pause after giving the next example. Many of you would have heard about the H-bond and RBS frauds. So the Police and Crime Commissioner for Thames Valley, his name is Anthony Stansfeld, he prosecuted half a dozen people connected with HBOS frauds, but he had no more resources and therefore he could not really do anything. He directly wrote to Prime Minister Theresa May, and I read out some excerpts from his letters, which are on parliamentary record if you want to look at. And he basically said, the city is mired in frauds, scandal, and it is corrupt to the core. And I really need to speak to you because nobody else wants to do anything. So she asked the cabinet secretary to respond to him. And the cabinet secretary wrote to the police commissioner, said, I'm very concerned about what you've written and I'll be delighted to meet you. Well, after that, suddenly a kind of absolute silence descended upon 10 Downing Street. Nothing more was heard. So the police commissioner then wrote back and said, look, I'd like to meet, you agreed to meet me. And then the reply came from the cabinet office, sorry, I can't meet you to discuss it. So somebody somewhere pulled some strings. And in his letter, the Police and Crime Commissioner said the two former chancellors and the Treasury are directly implicated in cover-ups of the banking frauds in the UK. Okay, you can't get a higher authority of a police officer saying this. Okay, and this is now public knowledge because it is in my speech in the House of Lords. Now, The biggest banking fraud of 20th century was at the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. That was forcibly shut in July 1991. Here we are in June 2021. There is still no investigation in the UK. That was the biggest banking fraud of 20th century. No bank, no investigation. There were some secret reports which have never ever been published. Through academic research with a US colleague, I became aware of one such secret document. My colleague in the US visited the National Congress Library, and hey presto, this document was sitting in the Congress Library. We did not know whether it was complete or incomplete at that stage, so I put in a request under the Freedom of Information laws to say I would like to see it. This document is sitting in the Congress Library. I was supposed to get a reply in 20 days, but 2 years later, the Treasury said I can't. It is not in the public interest for me to see a document, most of which is sitting in the US Congress Library, and I'd already seen it. Well, okay, I went to the Information Commissioner. He sided with the government. Well, then the only option for me was to go to the courts, which I did, represented myself. Altogether, it took 5.5 years, and 3 judges unanimously ordered the government to release that document to me. I have it. It is on the internet. It's called the Sandstorm Report. Anybody can see it. Okay, what does it show? The government protecting the crooks of the highest order. Crooks involved with Al-Qaeda, Saudi intelligence, royal families in the Middle East, smugglers, gun runners, you name it, they are in the report and they were being protected. So I asked in Parliament last March, last April, even before that, this March, April, and even before that, would it now release this document? No, it is still a state secret. The government wishes to offer no explanation, no rationale, does not want any debate. You can judge for yourself. If corruption, fraud is protected to this extent, how can we as citizens be protected? What happens to our rights? Okay, so that is just some of the kind of a background to where we are. But obviously we need to change the political system in this country. PR may be better than first past the post, or maybe even citizens committees. But current system is just a kind of a dictatorship. We've got to change the corporate governance system. In other European countries, most of the other European countries, there are worker elected directors on board. It's not a panacea, but it is better than what we have. We need free collective bargaining, stronger trade unions, otherwise the workers' share is going to continue to decline. And at the end, even the big business will be saying, oh dear, we can't sell our own products and services. People haven't got enough money. Okay. We got to improve the work environment, pay and conditions, and 0-hour contracts, give people security. We need to broaden the tax base. We need to redistribute income and wealth, possibly a wealth tax, financial transaction tax. Last Labour manifesto had a proposal for what they call the high pay levy. Maybe I can explain that later. I initially called it inequality tax. We need to empower stakeholders. I already said workers on company boards get workers and consumers to vote on executive pay. Let us see how we can constrain these people. We need to change the regulatory system, put ordinary people on the boards of the regulators, such as a Financial Conduct Authority, for example. They can then ask appropriate questions, make sure that the executives don't just continue to serve their paymasters. We need public ownership of essential services, whether it is water, gas, electricity, railways, and others. That is one way of ending profiteering. 8.5 billion in subsidies to railways last year. Most of it ends up in the pockets of executives or shareholders, which ironically are companies who are owned by foreign states. Here, even local councils can't bid to run the railway system. We need to reduce the size and the power of the finance industry. We all want bank accounts, insurances, credit cards, debit cards, pensions. What we don't want is reckless speculation and fraud. And a lot of what the city does is basically speculation. We need to shackle tax those who are selling tax avoidance schemes. We should also embrace openness. All the tax returns of all big corporations should be publicly available, as they should also be for richer people. That is the case in places like Finland. The world hasn't come to an end. If I can check anybody's tax return, I might even become suspicious whether they have declared everything or not. So every citizen can become a responsible citizen. Need a universal basic income. That is the way to lift people out of poverty. State pension should not be less than the minimum wage. That should be a crime to condemn people to half the national minimum wage. We need to reduce the age for state pension. There's a terrible injustice has been done to women born in the 1950s when the government suddenly raised their retirement state pension age. So if you go to places like Blackpool, the average life expectancy is about 74 years. So when they raise the state pension age, what has happened? That means the poor people will receive state pension for a much shorter period. Rich people tend to live longer. So there's a huge wealth transfer from the poorest to the richest by simply raising the state pension age. When they talk about equality, well, equality seen how? Measured how? That is another issue. Like to see a free college, university education for everyone. If people want to retrain, that should be free. That is the only way we are going to build up a bank of skilled labor. What is the government doing? The government is hoping to entice skilled workers from some emerging developing economy, which means there's a brain drain. So somebody like Zimbabwe spends a fortune on developing a surgeon. Then they arrive over here. Zimbabwe doesn't get any compensation for that. So therefore, they can't build their health system. They can't let their economy develop. So apologies, I've spoken a bit too long. I got carried away here, but I'll pause now. Okay, thank you.
Prem, thank you for that fantastic talk, which it's a really shocking indictment of our economic consensus and the relationship between money and power in this country. So I found it fascinating. We'll open up to the floor now, and I see some hands are coming up already. If anyone wants to ask a question but doesn't want to appear on the stream, please pop something in the chat instead, and we can read those out. Let's go to Gerard first, as he's got his hand up though.
Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I enjoyed Sam's introduction. I think according to Wikipedia, you're a West Ham fan as well.
I am, definitely.
We both suffer from that particular affliction. Basically, I was going to ask about the report you mentioned from the US Congress. Is it called the Sandstorm Report?
No. You mean the one, the Sandstorm is the one relating to BCCI, okay?
But,
now, yeah, what happened is that if you put on Google my name, followed by the words Sandstorm Report, it will actually come up. If you can't, just send me an email and I will send you a link. So the background is that when BCCI was closed, the Bank of England hurriedly commissioned a report. It was prepared by Price Waterhouse. The report was never finalized. It was prepared, and that was given to Bank of England, and it provided all kinds of details of fraud at BCCI. So in the US, the Foreign Affairs Senate Committee, which was chaired by a man called Senator John Kerry, who's now back in favor in the Biden regime, he chaired it, and he then asked, firstly, he asked the Bank of England, can we have this Sandstorm report, please? Bank of England said, you can't, it's a confidential document. So they went to Federal Reserve in the US, said, can you get this report for us? They said, yes, sir, we get it for you. So Federal Reserve got this redacted, i.e. some bits were blacked out, and they gave that to the to Senator Kerry's committee. So in the US, the rules are that if a Senate committee has any evidence, it must be made publicly available. Hence, that document is sitting in the Congress library. Later on, that committee got a clean copy of the report from another source, but they did not put that in the Congress library. So what my colleague in the US was spotted was this redacted version, which I then put on the website many years ago, but I always wondered how complete it was. And later on, once the courts ordered the government to release the document to me, I found that it was about 99% complete, but what was missing was all the names of the crucial people. And so by comparing what we found in the Congress library with what the courts ordered the government to give to me, you could see what was missing. Now, the normal thing that when government releases some hefty document, it goes on some government website, government department or other website. My document was never released, never put on any government website. As I said, even now they don't want to release it. And when I was engaged in a legal battle, I'm not a lawyer, by the way, I was just teaching myself a bit of law. And I thought, well, let's have a bit of fun here. Mind you, what wasn't funny, was not that enjoyable, was very stressful. So basically, the government had to release that document. I had to write my notes and many other things. I've written one academic paper around all this process as to what happened, how happened, what the issues were, what issues does it raise. If you're interested in that, drop me an email, and again, I will send you a link. But I think the thing is that in that case, we became aware, people became aware that there were documents. The question is, how many other frauds and fiddles have been covered up where there is no document? I gave you the example of HSBC, quietly dumped, yes, did absolutely nothing. And then it came back to haunt them again via the US. Another committee looking at it and saying, hang on, this bank had the biggest fine going. Why? And it said it was engaged in, quote, criminal conduct. Why on earth no prosecution? And then they reproduced a letter from George Osborne and some emails and letters from the UK authorities. And you're saying these people are supposed to be protecting us from frauds and fiddles. Now, imagine, on the other hand, if there were representatives of the stakeholders, the people on regulatory, but might they have said, hang on, one, you can't do this, or two, if you're doing this, you got to make a public statement. If you don't, I will resign and I will tell the people why I'm resigning. Is that a way of cleaning up the system? We need to clean up the system. It is corrupt, and that's so. I've been giving these kind of examples in Parliament, but so far ministers have totally ignored the questions I asked. They choose not to reply.
I think, like you said, there's been a financial crisis every decade since 1970. There's several books you could read about the financial crisis. I was going to ask one question to make one point, basically. I used to work for the Office of Fair Trading in terms of being regulators. Most of my friends will work for regulators of GM, of gas, of com. And like you said, the level of hand-in-glove relationships with the people who have to regulate is completely off the chart, really. And I saw some of it when I worked in the Office of Fair Trading. But for me, what Biden's suggesting in terms of corporate taxation could be the start of a worldwide support for things like the Tobin tax on financial transactions, which I think would be a good thing. About time we slowed some of the speculation and the fast money flying around. That's me personally. And in terms of the NHS, the point you make was well made. There are more Ghanaian doctors in the NHS than in Ghana. Doctors trained in Ghana are poached by the NHS. I worked in the NHS for 30 years, as well. And basically, there's more Ghanaian doctors working in the NHS than in Ghana, paid for and trained by Ghana. So we still qualified, skilled clinicians from other countries, and then complain about immigration. It is a frightening aspect of British hypocrisy, in my opinion. But thank you very much, sir. Up the hammers.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I'm looking to a good season in Europe for West Ham with the next season. I think the point you made about Biden, the minimum corporate rate of tax is probably a good thing, but Biden is not really seeking to kill off tax because the Biden proposals would mean that the countries where multinationals are located will get the biggest tax take. Okay, now that creates all sorts of problems about profit shifting, but nevertheless, is different from what we have now. Financial transaction tax already exists, has existed in this country since year 1600 something. There's a levy charge when you buy a share in a company. All you have to do is extend that levy to all other financial transactions. You can even create an exemption and say first 10,000 no tax. So if you're going on holiday buying foreign currency, you don't have to pay any transaction tax on it. There was a similar, a very mild version of financial transaction tax in the last Labour manifesto, which was utterly misrepresented, as you would expect in the media. And so that could be one way. I think we will need to revisit these because that is a way of broadening the tax base. We need to broaden the tax base. But what I see in the media is some politicians frightening people. Well, if you want the NHS rebuilt, you want this done, that done, we've got to increase the basic rate of corporation tax, a basic rate of income tax. That's just not on. I've just given you an example. We can have 14 billion by just eliminating the perks associated with capital gains tax. 10 billion for reforming the tax relief on pensions, add to that financial transaction tax. And things like a high pay levy. You can raise billions. And what about the £1 trillion not collected for the last decade? So we should not fall for this argument that if we don't pay higher taxes, we must forego hard-won social rights. That is just propaganda to frighten us.
Thank you,
So
sir.
just bear that in mind. Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
sir.
Prem. We've got one in the chat first, so I'll read that out from Sanjukta. What is the best model for creating independent bodies to investigate financial regulatory authorities?
Well, the best is difficult to define. There are all kinds of models and cultures. So in the compared to the UK, the US Securities Exchange Commission does a pretty good job. But when I talk to American colleagues, they think the SEC is pretty lousy. And then I ask them to look at the Financial Conduct Authority, and they say, my God, you got that kind of a regulator, which does not even begin an investigation. What we had, some of us had written a report for the Labour front bench when John McDonnell was Shadow Chancellor. He said, what do we do about regulatory bodies? So we met lots and lots of people, racked our brains, spoke to many people who've been unjustly treated. The regulators failed them. The solution we come up with was that we got about 700 regulators in the UK. That's crazy. There are 25 dealing with money laundering, 22 of which are trade associations, like the Institute of Chartered Accountants Law Society, and they are also outside the Freedom of Information Net. You can't even ask them any questions. So the solution we come up with was that regulators should have two-tier boards. So currently they have an executive board. We said, fine. Then we want another board made up entirely of people, stakeholders. Now, how you select those stakeholders is open to debate, but in principle, stakeholders could be somebody from Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, England, could be somebody from a small investor. You know, you may have money in London Capital and Finance, and you may be interested. That was essentially the model. So the supervisory board, as we called it, made up of stakeholders, would actually be responsible for appointing the executives, monitoring their performance, and they would hold open public meetings and ask, why have you still not investigated the RBS fraud? What's going on? Okay, have you got enough resources? We read this in a paper. We had this complaint, and this whistleblower has written to us. Now we are passing the matter to you and would like a report next month, please. In other words, people overseeing the regulators. So that was what we could think of on how to democratize the regulatory bodies, how to make people in charge, in control. I suggested an amendment like that recently in Parliament, where we discussed the Financial Services Bill, and needless to say, the vested interests were not pleased. Their response was, we must have professionals, not ordinary people. And my response was, so where were these professionals telling us about the banking crash or the people's pension schemes being looted? They didn't speak up. Okay, ordinary people were telling us what is wrong, and what is wrong with listening to ordinary people. So in other words, supervisory board was not going to be responsible for the day-to-day running. They are, in a sense, an oversight, an inbuilt structure. So at the moment, what happens is parliamentary committees can investigate. So if there's a scandal like London Capital Finance, they come in. But the problem is they only focus on one scandal at a time. They don't examine the whole conduct of the regulatory body. And that is what is needed. So Labour manifesto, again, to remind you, had a commitment that if Labour was in power, it would have commissioned an independent inquiry, an independent public inquiry into the finance industry, because no other industry has been so consistently mired in scandals. So that was a way of sort of cleaning it up and having a different kind of a regulatory system.
Oh, I'm on mute still. Thank you, Prem. Let's go over to Sam now, because Sam's had her hand up for a long time.
Thank you. Thanks, Prem. Yes, I'm really horrified that the Tory party knows all of this and presides over this, what is a scandal that takes so much from our economy and makes so many people impoverished. So I wondered, is Labour's plan, whatever plan we have, ambitious enough to tackle all of this? And I know that Labour is consulting on policy now, and Keir Starmer is asking for ideas from people about how we should, what our policy should be. So I'd like you to input into that and tell him all of your ideas. And one thing I have heard as well is about the idea of nationalising banks, because as you said, they're a drain currently on whatever we have in the economy, and they're not serving people. And I've heard it suggested, I think it's by the Fabian Society, that possibly we should have a nationalised system of finance. I also wondered, so I've got a few questions, just what can ordinary people like me or people in this constituency do? And I also wondered if you'd send us all those links to all those materials you have, and we'd gladly put it on our website to publish, to publicise the information that you want to put out there. We would be glad to do that, and it would be a learning curve for us as well, and we'd appreciate that. I also wondered about developing countries. So we mentioned how the brain drain is affecting them. We also know that the UK is cutting aid from international aid from 0.7% GDP. It's cutting it at a time when developing countries have never needed that aid more than now in this crisis. And we can see the vaccine nationalism as well. So we need to help other countries as well as think about what we can do to untangle this mess, which has also affected other countries. Our philosophy of doing these private finance initiatives has also infected what people do overseas and bled their countries and their services too, I think. So that was what I felt, and I wondered if you could input into the policy that Keir Starmer wants to put together. He's discarding that 2019 manifesto, and I'm upset about that because I liked that manifesto. There was a lot in there. It was, as people say, the size of a novel, but what a manifesto it was. It had some good things in there that we don't need to throw away, I don't think. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Samantha. Yeah, I mean, the 2017-19 manifestos were quite radical. So much so that even the Tories have been cherry picking and revarnishing some of those things, like moving some treasury jobs to the north, for example. Not all of them, or some of them, for example, they've been talking about. They also commissioned a paper on what would happen if we abolished the tax perks which people get under capital gains. Again, Labour's proposal was to commission a review as well. So they've been doing that. I know Annalise Dodds, and I worked with her when she was in John McDonnell's Treasury team. So I do hope that many of the ideas would be retained. But that said, nothing can remain fixed. The world changes, and you do have to respond to changes and weigh things up. But what you need to do is have what I call kind of a correct antenna to say, where do you want to go? And given the statistics that I cited, I don't think we can impoverish people anymore. I think we need to build up our social services, and we've seen the deadly consequences with COVID. When you have a poor national health service, your support services were not in place, people did not have access to good food, housing, healthcare, etc. They suffered. So we can't really go back to that. So I think, whatever the policies the Labour leadership eventually comes up with, they will have to make sure that they address the social needs. At banks, there are lots of interesting things when you start looking at lots of occupations and industries. You wonder, why are they separate from the state? Let's just think about the banks. Banks are bailed out by taxpayers or the state. The state is the lender of last resort. The state's giving them raw material almost free. The state gives them a deposit-taking license. The state gives them limited liability, without which they won't have the right to dump when things go wrong, like BCCI, for example. State sends millions of customers to banks each year. For example, all social security benefits are in the main now paid through the banking system rather than the post office. Then you say, well, what is it that we are getting in return? Well, we are getting closure of bank branches. Many city centres just don't have bank branches anymore. Many villages don't have them. So there is good kind of a question. What is it that we are getting in return? And one possibility could be, well, if we think a lot of these things are essential, let's bring them into public ownership. Of course, the finance industry's got used to privatizing profits, socializing losses, collecting subsidies. They are not going to like it. But somebody one day will have to, put forward that. Now, I personally can't see Keir Starmer putting forward a policy of that kind, but he will have to be radical, because if he moves to the right, even more to the right, well, he's not going to persuade Tory voters to vote for him. By moving to the right, he will end up antagonizing people kind of left of centre. And what the Hartlepool and the local council election showed us was that a lot of Labour supporters migrated to the Greens. And, that they found that more comfortable. Now, whether that is temporary or permanent, we wait and see. What should people do? Well, to start with, what you are doing, we are talking about it. So that is talking about it, kind of a necessary condition for what people might say is a revolution of social consciousness. So that is the only revolution which lasts. And, in this era of social media, we can have many meetings like this, inviting different people to start a debate and everybody else sort of join in. Mainstream media leaves a lot to be desired, is generally very poor. There was a well-known journalist who resigned from the Daily Telegraph. He said because they were forbidden to write negative stories about HSBC, because HSBC was a major advertiser and they did not want to antagonize it. I'm an accountant by training. There are accountancy magazines owned by professional bodies. There are one or two others who are not owned by professional bodies, but they all rely on advertising. Do they carry any negative news about big accounting firms, incredibly rare. They know who they must not upset. So we are up against that. Developing countries and brain drain. Yeah, I've been thinking about that, whether I should really put down an amendment to a bill currently going through Parliament. The bill is called Professional Qualifications Bill. So we left the EU, but there's been no agreement about mutual recognition of qualifications. So what the UK is now saying, okay, we will pass legislation. In other words, first we could repeal the bit when we were in the EU. Now we will pass legislation to make it easier to get mutual recognition of qualification. But one consequence of that is that you will be getting doctors from Ghana. And then what is Ghana left with? Having invested a vast amount in an individual, at the end, no health system, no boost to the economy to show for it. And indeed, there are serious dangers that the UK, and I think we're seeing this, the UK has kind of abandoned its own infrastructure necessary for development of lots of professionals. If you can get them at a fraction of a cost from Ghana, why do you want to spend billions training them here? Yeah. So at the end, you find your own, your own infrastructure vanishes. You're not self-reliant. You can't deal with pandemics. So if COVID becomes a kind of a semi-permanent problem for next few years, you're going to need jabs and you're going to need special treatment, say, for the next 5 to 10 years, what are we going to do? Then raiding other countries. So I'm aware that the NHS has been raiding for doctors and nurses in India. Well, India's got its own crisis and it can't deal with it. They haven't got enough professionals, even though they produce them. That is a problem. And it's really a one-way traffic. It's traffic from emerging, developing economies to the UK. Not many Brits would want to go and work in Ghana for their salaries.
Thanks, Prem. Social consciousness, the only revolution that lasts. I love that. I think I'll have to remember that one. You also touched on something. You started to talk about the electoral dimension to tax policy, which ties in with Jane in the chat has asked, how do you persuade voters to vote for Labour who need to raise taxes for middle income and high earners? I think that's that's a question that a lot of us will be occupied by.
Well, you don't actually have to raise taxes. This is what I was saying earlier. What about things like financial transaction tax? What about reforming capital gains tax? What about reforming pensions, for example? Yeah. And what about collecting the HMRC said last year it failed to collect £31 billion of taxes. In earlier years, it's 34 to 35 billion. Other models say it's between 58 and 100 plus billion. So let me give you an example how these taxes are avoided. This is based on a real example relating to BHS. I know this because I was advisor to Work and Pensions Committee for investigating the collapse of BHS. So BHS had many stores, which it needs. BHS did not do anything unlawful. What it did was perfectly legal. Okay, so they had many stores. Lady Green was the majority shareholder. I think it was about 98% into BHS. Okay, so she formed a company in Jersey. Okay, BHS sold some of his stores to this company in Jersey. So Lady Green is writing a check from Jersey to BHS in the UK, which she controls. So effectively, there's no money going anywhere. Okay, all right. So BHS sells properties to this company in Jersey. Of course, it needs the stores, so it leases them back. So the net effect of that is now BHS starts paying rent on the stores in the UK. That rent becomes a tax-deductible expense. Therefore, it reduces BHS's tax liability in the UK. Previously, it paid no rents because it owned the stores outright. In Jersey, the rents are received by a company whose sole shareholder is Lady Green. Jersey does not levy corporation tax unless the transaction takes place in Jersey. So there was no transaction in Jersey. The profit is booked there. There is no corporation tax. That company then pays dividend. That dividend is paid to Lady Green, who was resident in Monaco. Monaco does not have any income tax. Now, out of thin air, BHS has suddenly found a way of paying, because if BHS paid dividends, media be reporting, Philip Green paid so much dividend. No dividend is paid, but there's a huge return for the shareholders just the same. And it's got a tax deductible expense at the same time. That kind of transaction does not form part of HMRC's model for the tax gap. So when he says it's failed to collect 31, 35 billion, these kind of transactions are not captured by its model. What do likes of Microsoft, Google, Amazon do? They shift profits. How do they shift profits? Well, through intra-group transactions. You can say, I received some management advice from a company based in Bahamas, got to pay them X million. Who the hell knows whether you received the advice or not? But you got it. You've got to make sure paperwork is there. Therefore, you reduce the UK taxable profits with those transactions. The other side is tax-free. So there are lots of royalties, management fees. The classic cases are cases about bananas. I don't know if you've ever heard about bananas. So bananas leave Costa Rica, a typical pack, let us say, it costs about 10.5 pence to produce. That is what the producer receives. The local then buyer adds 1.5 pence profit, that is 12. The same bananas in Tesco's or Sainsbury's will sell for 60 pence, will sell for £1. You say, hang on, how the hell did they jump from 12 pence to the pound? Tesco's typical profit out of that pound is 40 pence. They'll leave 60 pence cost. How did that 12 pence become 60 pence cost? Well, the bananas would be loaded onto a ship or plane or whatever. They will then say there is marketing. Who's done the marketing? Oh, that's a company in the Bahamas. Then there was something about research. Who did that? Oh, that's a company in the Caymans. Who arranged the finance? So that's a company somewhere. So all these costs are spread and then added on. Okay, and the final leg of that is in Jersey. You know, Jersey does some purchasing. So Jersey does not grow bananas, but actually is the biggest exporter of bananas to the UK on paper. Okay, so that 12 pence becomes a 60p, and then you go and pay £1 for it. The rest of the money is siphoned off through lots of intra-group transactions that is added on, and they're laughing. So that system was devised at the time of League of Nations. So at the time of League of Nations, they devised a tax system. I won't bore you, but just one or two aspects. One of the principles was that each limited liability company will be known as a separate taxable person. So if Google has 500 subsidiaries, you have 500 taxable persons, which is wrong. Because if you got 500 separate taxable person, what do? You engage in these intra-group transactions, shifting things around. On the other hand, if we said there is only one Google, because there's only one Google logo, only one Google name, one board of directors, one share price, yeah, we will add up the profits of all the 500 companies. If you did that, you find all this shifting profit around will cancel themselves out, because cost in one place is income somewhere else. They will have no effect. And then you could allocate what is left, i.e. global profit, to each country in accordance with a formula, which could be based on where your sales are. So tax havens won't have many sales. Could be based on where the employees are. Could be based on where the productive assets are. And that is a system called unitary taxation. It was proposed by the European Union way back around about 1991, and UK continued to veto it. Now we are out of it. I'm pretty sure within the next 5 years, the EU will be embracing this system. Okay, so so they are shifting. So we have to be smarter. That's the real problem in the UK. We don't. Governments seem to be content with it. They give in to the corporate lobby, and therefore, people have to talk about it and say, well, why can't you? So next, governments have found it too easy to load taxes onto labour, savings, and consumption. That is wrong.
Mm. Thank
That
you.
hurts the poorest.
Yeah. I personally, I think one of the difficulties for Labour in getting a hearing on taxing, on taxing and our policy in relation to corporates in general is that small businesses and sole traders, they do have this thing still where a lot of those voters identify quite strongly with a corporate lobby. And when you have stories appearing that cast Labour as anti-business, I think that ripples down to people who are certainly not bad actors and are the sort of businesses that we would want to promote and encourage and support as a healthier model of how you do capitalism and private enterprise. So I think it's a matter of how we put that across more effectively. We should probably be wrapping up soon. I'm going to pick Sanjukta's got a couple of questions in the chat, but there's a local one which I thought was really interesting. Is there any hope of a bottom-up approach through local government interventions and campaigns such as ethical investment? That's quite pertinent around here. So our local authority, Uttlesford, like all local authorities now, it has a substantial investment portfolio. Part of that, which has recently become public, is an investment in a headquarters for a defence company. Possibly Moog. I think it's a matter of public record now that it's Moog, which is in another local authority entirely and doesn't generate jobs here. Meanwhile, this is my son, Mike. He's going to bed now. Meanwhile, we have a lot of people in the district have suffered a lot through the pandemic. Our largest employer in the district is Stansted Airport, who obviously have a substantial carbon footprint, are not necessarily where we want to see the future of the district go. But there's a demand for ethical investment for things that will generate new green jobs in this district and help us reorientate it in a way that's a more positive way to do enterprise. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on what you can do at a local level, what we can pressure a local authority on.
I would agree that ethical investment is the way forward, but I think we need to look at these investments also in a very different way. Generally, people tend to look upon the outcomes of investment in terms of profit rather than value added. Now, let me just sort of explain that. Many of you would have seen companies produce an income statement or a profit and loss account. Now, first question you're going to ask yourself, how exactly is wealth generated? One response is, it is generated because a whole variety of stakeholders collaborate, they cooperate. Somebody provides finance, they get a return. Workers provide brain and brawn, they get a wage. Society provides social infrastructure, healthcare, education, security, law, etc. They get a return in the form of tax. Well, so far so good, but that is not how people then look at the results. Along come accountants and they say, look, we are going to prepare an income statement in which a wage is a cost, tax is a cost, dividends paid to shareholders are a reward. So the self-serving logic is, what must we do in life? We must reduce the burdens, reduce the costs. So therefore, a company can easily show you higher profit by cutting on wages, by not paying taxes, cutting on R&D, for example, and many other things. That's a wrong approach. The question we should be asking ourselves is not whether something is profitable, but whether value is added. So if you buy a piece of, I'm sitting here and there's a tablecloth, if you buy that cloth for £10, you embroider it, you do something, and you sell it for £100, you're saying, yeah, I added a value of 9. The adding of value gets marginalized. Once we know what value is added, the next question is, how do we share it as stakeholders? How much goes to labor, how much to capital, how much to society, etc. So we, I think, need to change the approach by which we evaluate our investments. That is one thing. Local councils can also play, and ethical investment funds can play a key role in curbing tax avoidance. Simple principle: no contracts for anybody engaged in tax avoidance. No local authority contract, no central government contract, no corporate business for anybody who's engaged in tax avoidance. Drive them out. And indeed, that was in the Labour manifesto, that Labour would not give public contracts to tax avoiders. And they were also going to look at tax havens as well, many of which are actually British. We call them crown dependencies and overseas territories.
Thank you.
There is always, look, between us, we can't do everything. But what I always say is that each and every one of us can do something. So let us do something about whatever, no matter how small, to give us a better world for our children, grandchildren, future generations.
Okay. I mean, that brings us very neatly round to 9 o'clock, which was when I was expecting that we would wrap up. So thank you very much. Someone is we're just having a discussion in another chat about whether we carry on. I mean, I think we've run out of questions in there as well. So I will let's conclude this part of the meeting, and we'll let you go for tonight. It's been a fascinating talk. Thank you very much for your time, Prem Sikka.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's always a great pleasure to make new friends. And hopefully we will meet up again, either in cyberspace or perhaps person to person. Well, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Andrew, are we dropping the YouTube bit now? Thank you.